There is a number painted on the canyon wall at Black Canyon, Nevada. Except nobody painted it, nature did. It is white. A mineral stain left behind by retreating water. A chalk ring that wraps around both walls of the gorge, from one end of Lake Mead to the other. At its tallest point, that ring is now more than 160 feet high, taller than a 15-story building. You can see it from the Las Vegas Strip on a clear day. You can see it from space. It marks every foot the lake has fallen since the water was full in the year 2000, and right now it is still growing. But the ring is not the thing that should worry you. The thing that should worry you is 600 feet below that ring, under the lake, in the dark, in solid rock, where a city of 2.3 million people drilled a 3-mile tunnel through the floor of a reservoir and sank a 100-foot concrete intake tower into the canyon bed, at a depth that no water system in American history had ever tried to reach before. Because they had to. Because, without it, Las Vegas would have already lost access to the water that keeps the entire city alive. And because even with it, the lake is still falling, the tunnel is now their only margin, and the margin is getting thinner every single year. This is not a story about a dam. It is a story about a city that built its entire existence on top of a water system that was already broken before the first casino ever opened, and about the $1.34 billion gamble it made to stay alive long enough to force the rest of the American West to face what is coming. To understand what Las Vegas actually did under Lake Mead, you have to understand what was already there. Hoover Dam was finished in 1935, 2 years ahead of schedule, by 5,000 men working around the clock through Black Canyon summers where the temperature hit 120 degrees. 96 workers died in the build. The dam is 726 feet tall, 660 feet thick at the base, and contains enough concrete to pave a 2-lane highway from San Francisco to New York City. When the gates closed and the Colorado River began backing up behind it, it took 6 years to fill the reservoir that would be called Lake Mead. At full pool, the lake holds 26.12 million acre-feet of water, roughly 2 years of Colorado River flow at its full long-term average, spread across 247 square miles of desert canyon. To get water from that lake to the city, engineers drilled intake tunnels through the canyon walls during original construction. The first 2 intakes were designed for a lake that stayed near full capacity. Intake number 1 sits at approximately 1,050 feet above sea level. Intake number 2 sits slightly lower. For most of the lake's history, those intakes sat hundreds of feet below the waterline. There was no engineering reason to build lower. The water would always be there. The Colorado Compact said so. The lawyers said so. The Bureau of Reclamation said so. Then the water started leaving, and it did not come back. The retreat began around 2000. A combination of back-to-back dry winters in the Rockies, an unprecedented 23-year megadrought, and a legal allocation system that had been promising 25 to 30% more water than the river actually carries, since 1922 began draining the lake at a rate that the dam's designers never anticipated. Every year, more water left than arrived. By 2010, the lake had dropped around 100 feet from full pool. By 2015, it had dropped another 30. By July of 2022, it sat at 1,040 feet, the lowest point since it was filled in the 1930s, nearly 180 feet below where it should be. The white bathtub ring on the canyon wall, invisible in the year 2000, had grown to a scar visible from commercial aircraft at 35,000 feet. As the lake fell, the physics of the original intake system began to change. At 1,050 feet, intake number 1 approaches its functional limit. The pipe that draws water for 2.3 million people and 40 million annual tourists was designed with a margin that the drought was steadily consuming. When the lake drops to that level, the first pipe effectively stops. Half of Las Vegas's water intake capacity goes offline. And the city had known for years this moment was approaching. Here is the detail that tells the real story. When the Southern Nevada Water Authority, the agency that manages Las Vegas's water, began serious planning for a third intake in the mid-2000s, the lake was already down more than 80 feet from full pool. Pat Mulroy, who had run the Water Authority since 1989, had been warning about this scenario for nearly a decade. She had read the climate projections. She understood the compact math. She understood that the Colorado River had been over-allocated from the day the ink dried on the 1922 agreement in Santa Fe, when 7 states split up 16.5 million acre-feet of a river whose actual long-term average flow, measured across more than 1,000 years of tree ring data from UCLA research, is closer to 12 to 13 million. She understood that Las Vegas, at the far downstream end of the system, with the smallest legal water allocation of any lower basin state, was the most exposed city on the entire river. She decided to drill. If you are finding this useful, subscribe. We cover water crises, infrastructure failures, and earth science events as they happen, with the full picture you need to understand what is actually going on. The project that became known as the Third Straw began construction in 2008. The plan was audacious. Engineers would drill a 3-mile tunnel through solid rock beneath the floor of Lake Mead, connect it to a new intake structure lowered from a barge into the deepest accessible part of the reservoir, and create a water supply pathway that could function even if the lake dropped far below the levels the original system could handle. The intake structure itself, a 100-foot concrete tower, cylindrical, somewhat like an enormous bathtub drain, was assembled in sections on land and lowered in stages into position in March of 2012, cemented to the canyon floor with the equivalent of 1,200 truckloads of concrete. Its top was capped with a 1,900-pound stainless steel ball that would keep it sealed until the tunnel was complete and ready to flood. The tunnel boring machine used to excavate the passage weighed 1,500 tons and ran 600 feet long. It was custom built in Germany by manufacturer Herrenknecht, designed specifically for the geological conditions under Lake Mead, and took 18 months to construct before it was shipped overseas, transported in pieces across Nevada, and lowered into its starting chamber, one section at a time. The machine ground forward through the rock at a depth of 600 feet below the lakebed, reinforcing its path with more than 2,400 interlocking 6-foot sections of precast concrete as it moved, building the tunnel wall behind it as it excavated ahead. Progress was measured in feet per day. In July of 2010, the boring machine hit something the geological surveys had not fully predicted: an unexpected fault line. The tunnel flooded. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of groundwater poured in. Workers evacuated. Engineers spent weeks pumping the tunnel dry, assessing the structural situation, and deciding how to proceed. 5 months after the first flood, in December of 2010, the tunnel flooded again. This time the assessment was different. The direction of the bore was compromised. The risk of continuing on the same path was judged too high. Engineers made the decision to seal and abandon the first tunnel entirely. A new bore was started from scratch in a different direction. 2 years of work gone. The project reset. In June of 2012, as the second bore was pushing toward the intake structure, a 44-year-old tunnel worker named Thomas Albert Turner was killed on site. He was from Henderson, Nevada, a married man, father of 2, whose brother also worked on the same project. His name does not appear in most accounts of the third straw. The stainless steel ball sitting on top of the intake tower, the completed tunnel, the water flowing into 2.3 million homes. None of it carries his name. But the project that Las Vegas needed to survive the next stage of the drought cost one man his life to complete. The tunnel boring machine made final contact with the intake structure on December 10, 2014, at 1 minute before noon. The project team was on target within the margin their engineers had promised. Operational activation came in September of 2015, when the 1,900-pound stainless steel ball was lifted by a crane barge from the top of the intake tower, and water pressure flooded the 3-mile tunnel for the first time. The top of the intake structure sits at 860 feet above sea level. That is 190 feet below intake number 1. It is 35 feet below dead pool. The elevation, 895 feet above sea level, at which water can no longer flow through Hoover Dam by gravity. Las Vegas built its water lifeline below the point where the dam itself stops, functioning. That was not an accident. It was a calculation. The city looked at the projections, looked at the compact math, looked at the trajectory of the lake, and decided to build for a future that everyone else was still pretending would not arrive. But the intake at 860 feet cannot function on its own. Below an elevation of 1,000 feet, the existing pump stations that move water from the tunnel to the treatment facilities cannot operate. The lake level has to stay above 1,000 feet for the third straw to flow without additional infrastructure, which is why the Southern Nevada Water Authority approved an additional low-level pumping station, a project that added roughly $520 million to the overall cost, bringing the total investment in this single piece of water security infrastructure to somewhere around $1.34 billion. That pumping station ensures that water can be extracted and moved to treatment even if Lake Mead drops well below the 1,000-foot threshold. It is the backup, too. The backup. A pump station built specifically to operate in conditions that water engineers once described as a scenario they did not think they would ever face. Now step back from the engineering and look at what the numbers actually mean in 2026. Lake Mead currently sits around 1,050 to 1,070 feet above sea level, depending on the week and the season. It has recovered somewhat from the catastrophic 2022 low of 1,040 feet, helped by a strong snowpack year in the Rockies in 2022 to 23. But that recovery has been partial, and the gap that remains is enormous. The lake needs to sit at 1,221 feet to be at full pool. Even after 2 years of improved snowpack, it is sitting roughly 150 to 170 feet below where it should be. And the shape of the canyon is the part of this story that is hardest to convey without the physics of what a V-shaped cross-section actually means for water volume. At full pool, the canyon is wide. Each foot of elevation holds a large volume of water because the lake is spread across a broad surface area. As the lake falls and the canyon narrows, the same 1-foot drop in elevation holds a smaller and smaller volume. When the lake was 150 feet below full pool, losing each foot cost the system a certain amount of stored water. As it drops toward the 200-foot mark and below, each foot of drop is faster because the canyon is narrower and there is less volume per foot. The lake that looks like it is stabilizing on a headline graph is actually approaching a zone where stabilization becomes physically harder and acceleration becomes physically easier. This is not opinion, it is geometry. Dead pool sits at 895 feet. Hydropower generation stops around 950 feet. The third straw intake sits at 860 feet. The gap between where the lake currently sits and where these failure thresholds begin is real, but it is not comfortable. A few back-to-back dry winters in the Rockies, the kind the region experienced from 1999 through 2007 and again through the 2010s, would compress that gap faster than the Bureau of Reclamation's most probable projection scenarios account for. The broader system that feeds Lake Mead is simultaneously under pressure from upstream. Lake Powell, the second largest reservoir in the country, sits about 300 miles upstream on the Utah-Arizona border behind Glen Canyon Dam. It holds the water that eventually flows down to Lake Mead. In 2022, Lake Powell dropped so low that the Bureau of Reclamation made emergency water releases from Flaming Gorge Reservoir in Wyoming, more than 400 miles further upstream, just to keep Glen Canyon Dam above its own minimum operating threshold. The federal government was essentially moving water from one failing reservoir to another to prevent a cascade failure that would have cut hydropower across the entire upper Colorado system simultaneously. Both lakes recovered partially. Both remain far below their storage capacity. Both are drawing from the same shrinking source, the Colorado River. That feeds them is not producing what the 1922 Compact promised. It has never produced what the 1922 Compact promised. The men who divided the river in a Santa Fe lodge more than 100 years ago were working from flow records gathered during an unusually wet stretch of years, a decades-long anomaly that made the river look larger and more reliable than it actually was. The tree ring research done at UCLA over the last 2 decades found that the compact allocated 25 to 30% more water than the river has ever consistently carried. Some scientists at the negotiations in 1922 raised concerns about the flow measurements. Their concerns were set aside because 7 states had finally agreed on something, and nobody wanted to reopen a deal already reached. So they signed it, cheered it, built cities on top of it, and handed the gap to the future. The future is 2026. The 2007 Interim Guidelines, the federal framework that manages how shortage cuts are distributed among Nevada, Arizona, and California when the lake drops, expired at the end of 2026 and need to be replaced with a new operating agreement. Arizona has already absorbed the largest mandatory shortage cuts of any lower basin state and is resistant to accepting more. California, which uses more Colorado River water than any other state and holds some of the oldest and most legally protected water rights on the river, is defending allocations it has held for generations. Nevada, despite recycling nearly every drop of its indoor water back into Lake Mead and achieving genuine reductions in total consumption, even as its population has grown by hundreds of thousands, holds the smallest legal allocation and the most precarious position. Mexico, with a treaty right to 1.5 million acre-feet per year, signed in 1944, cannot be simply negotiated out of its share by American states arguing among themselves. The river carries 12 to 13 million acre-feet in an average year. The 7 American states and Mexico are legally entitled to 17 to 18 million. No new agreement changes that arithmetic. No negotiation adds snowpack to the Rockies. No summit in Washington adds a single acre-foot to what the Colorado actually produces. What the $1.34 billion tunnel does is buy Las Vegas a position at the table. While Arizona farms dry up, and while California cities face mandatory rationing, and while Pinal County farming families watch their fields crack, and while the Cocopah people at the dried mouth of the Colorado wait for a river that no longer arrives, Las Vegas can still drink. Not because the city deserves water more than anyone else, because it spent more than $1.3 billion drilling deeper than anyone else was willing to go. That intake tower at 860 feet sits in what used to be a canyon of the Colorado River, before Hoover Dam backed the water up in 1935. The river that carved that canyon, the river that cut a mile-deep gorge through solid rock over 6 million years, producing one of the most recognizable geological features on the surface of the Earth, no longer reaches the sea. It dries up somewhere south of the Mexican border in the Sonoran Desert, miles before it reaches the Sea of Cortez. The Cocopah people, whose name in their own language means river people, watched their river disappear within a single human lifetime. The stainless steel ball that sealed the third straw intake for 3 years of flooding and boring and construction now sits in a storage facility somewhere in the Las Vegas infrastructure system. The tunnel it once sealed is full of water. The pumps are running. The taps in Las Vegas are flowing. The white ring on the canyon wall at Black Canyon has grown past 160 feet and is still climbing toward a number, 895 feet above sea level, that was once considered impossible to reach. The third straw reaches 35 feet below that number. Las Vegas is drinking from the bottom of a glass that it knows is still emptying. It has just drilled a straw, longer and deeper than anything the American West has ever built before. And it is doing it in a canyon whose walls keep telling the same story every day, one white foot at a time. That no straw, no matter how deep, solves the problem of a river being asked to carry water it does not have.